My name is John Hamre. I'm the president here at CSIS, and my role is strictly ornamental. I'm here just simply to welcome all of you and thank you for coming for what I think will be an exceptionally interesting conversation. I have to say, let me just share with you, first time I ever met Prime Minister Rudd, and you were Prime Minister at the time, and I was invited to go to Blair House. I didn't know exactly why I got that invitation, but I did, and it was a remarkable evening. And I was struck by, normally when you meet with politicians, there tends to be a kind of an aggressive superficiality to everything. So you cover it all, and it's with fervor, and it's a millimeter thick of substance. This was a seminar, and it was a remarkable evening. I still remember it, and it was a seminar about Australia in Asia and the challenge of a rising China. And kind of a word to us: we need to be smarter than we are. That is universally helpful in Washington. But this was an introduction to a remarkable intellect, and much to my surprise, he was asked, and he decided to come here to Washington to be Australia's ambassador. But he has not set aside this burning intellectual ferment that's inside of him to share remarkable insights. And I know of no one who has more interesting thoughts about China and has been more objective about how China's evolved than my reading of Kevin Rudd through these years. And so this is really a wonderful opportunity for us to hear directly this conversation. Thank you for writing the book, and I'm delighted that you are giving us the opportunity to hear you today. Charlie Edel is going to give a formal introduction. As I said, my role is ornamental. Charlie, why don't you come up and make a formal introduction for the Right Honorable. I said the only thing missing in his title is Lord, but we'll work on that later. Okay. Go on, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hamre. I'm Charles Edel. I'm a senior advisor in the inaugural Australia chair here at CSIS, and it's my distinct privilege to welcome the Honorable Dr. Ambassador Kevin Rudd back to the Center for Strategic and International Studies to discuss his new book, On Xi Jinping, How Xi's Marxist Nationalism is Shaping China and the World. Now, you'll excuse me if I sound a bit confused on that introduction, because, of course, our guest speaker is all of those things: a doctor, a professor, former leader of Australia, and, of course, now Australia's ambassador to the United States. As I'm sure everyone knows, Kevin Rudd served as Australia's 26th Prime Minister from 2007 to 2010. He then took a turn in the Foreign Ministry and then returned the Prime Ministership. He has, throughout his career, as you just heard, been an avid follower, student, analyst of China. This started with your very first tour in Beijing and has had multiple stops along the way, including a doctorate at Oxford, president and CEO of the Asia Society, and interestingly, standing up and helping to run the Policy Institute Center for China Analysis. I would say that it's this expertise in China, coupled with long experience dealing with China, that I think brings us all here today, but also has something to do with the fact that he was appointed here for his ambassadorship. And we are at a moment, an inflection point, as we've begun to term it here in Washington, in our relations with Beijing. This is a moment when our understanding of the Chinese Communist Party, our read of Xi Jinping, will determine not just how we think about China, but how we understand its ambitions, the timetable it's on, and its policies that it enacts. And probably more important than all of those things is it will determine and set the contours for our response and our strategic settings over the next several decades. The new book that we're going to hear about today, I believe, will help prompt the debate here in Washington, in Canberra, and elsewhere about Xi's plans for the international order, about what might be needed and required to deter China, and what China might even be capable of looking like in a post-Xi Jinping world. So I will now exit stage right, or actually stage left. Kevin Rudd will join us on stage to make some opening remarks about the book, after which Jude Blanchette, the Freeman Chair here in China Studies at CSIS, will put him through his paces on the stage and, of course, open the conversation up to all of you. I also want to mention that for those of you who are here in the crowd, books are for sale. For those of you who are online, you know where Amazon is. And Ambassador Rudd has agreed to stick around for a little bit afterwards to talk about the book and sign this. But it's now my distinct privilege to welcome Ambassador Rudd to the stage.
Thanks very much, Charles, and thank you, John, for those kind words of introduction. It's an unusual experience for someone who's been in Australian politics to have anyone say something nice about you. And so John, I appreciate very much your remarks, as I do yours, Charles, and the work you do here in the AUKUS chair. The other thing I'd say is how much I value the work of CSIS. This is a veritable and venerable institution in the strategic policy landscape here in Washington and across the free world. And I admire the quality of the work which comes out of here. And I admire the convenings that you engage in. And it wasn't that long ago, I remember, John, you having Henry Kissinger on stage here in his 100th birthday year, interviewing Henry on the evolution of the three communiques. And it was a textured, detailed conversation of direct relevance to those of us who work in the world of public policy. And it's a further example of the excellent work done here in this city and in this country by CSIS. So good to be among you, colleagues, and thank you for having me here. I'm here as a private scholar. I'm not here to address you as Australia's ambassador. This is a piece of academic research I launched way back in 2017. And having finally graduated from Jesus College, Oxford in 2022, I was then faced with the daunting task of turning an academic thesis into English, and which would be comprehensible to the rest of the world, or at least the English-speaking world. So that was part of my sort of nighttime activity in the last 12 months. And so, as you know, when you produce a book, it's a little bit like the birth of the elephant. It's long, it's painful, and eventually an elephant appears, and that's the book which you have before you. So my remarks today are very much in a personal capacity. I'll just make some introductory remarks about the argument outlined in the book, and then let's pursue it in conversation with Jude. The core question I seek to ask in this book, and why I embarked upon the academic research in the first place, is this. There's a body of literature now on how Xi Jinping has changed China, both its politics, its economy, its foreign policy, its security policy. The question, however, I found myself being asked most around the world is not how he was changing China, but why. What was the underpinnings of this significant, and I would argue radical change of course that we've seen in the last 12 years on the construction of Chinese politics, where they've taken the economy and where they've taken China's external engagement. And so the first point that I argue in this book is that in the Chinese Communist Party in its 100-year history, ideology, Marxism-Leninism, matters. It has always mattered, even during the period of Deng Xiaoping and reform and opening, and the 35 years from the third plenum of the 11th Central Committee in 1978 through to Xi Jinping getting the main job in 2012. Ideology still mattered, albeit to define a framework which was less ideological than that which preceded it. It still had to be done formally. And certainly, when we approach the enormous body of work which Xi Jinping and those underneath him have contributed to and evolving that which is called Xi Jinping thought on socialism, the Chinese characteristics in the new era, to give its full rendition, is that this matters as well in providing for the party what others have described as a band of meaning within which policy and behavioural change then occurs. In other words, it becomes, in the history of the party, under Mao, under Deng, and now under Xi, a set of organising principles which establish the permissible limits for dialogue, discourse, debate and policy direction. In other words, ideology in the Chinese system has always been a leading indicator of change. And therefore, that's why folks like me take it seriously. And therefore, that's why I sought to fill what I saw as something of a gap in the debate on contemporary Chinese politics and foreign policy, a gap which existed on the actual content of Xi Jinping's ideological change. Second set of remarks I'd like to make here, but simply by way of summary in terms of the ideological changes that you can deduce if you study carefully the Xi Jinping canon. I summarise them in three parts, and those of you who've seen my summary work will know what I'm referring to. I have said that from the get-go in 2012-13, Xi Jinping deliberately undertook to move Chinese politics to the Leninist left, by which I mean a reassertion of the centrality and paramount status of the party in and overall within the country, including the paramount status of the leader of the party within the party. Some would say that's not just Leninist, that's also Stalinist. I'll leave that to the Sovietologists to resolve among themselves. You can have a fight in the back corner later on. But this deliberate, from the get-go, reassertion of the absolute centrality of the party. Those of you who know the language well will know that Xi Jinping's aphorism taken from Mao, quote, "It doesn't matter whether we are north, south, east or west, whether we are talking about government, whether we're talking about commerce, whether we're talking about the academy, whether we're talking about society. The party leads in all," unquote. That is an unambiguous statement, and certainly that has been the case. What the book then does is seek to describe how the laying down of those aphorisms about the centrality of this Leninist ideological worldview then are translated into a series of measures in real-world politics in China in the period from 2012-2013 onwards, one by one. Not just the anti-corruption campaign to restore ideological rigour and political purity to the ranks of the party, but in terms of the disciplinary regime imposed around what was permissible in terms of internal party debate. A new disciplined regime in terms of what was permissible in terms of debate within think tanks and the academy. A new set of disciplines in terms of what was permissible in terms of media discourse. In other words, a reassertion and an assertion of the centrality of a Leninist party and taking politics, therefore, to the Leninist left was not simply a series of abstractions out here in the metaphysical Marxist universe. It then is translated through into real policy and behavioural change in the Chinese system. The second element of ideological change, which I map in the book, is what I say and describe as Xi Jinping's decision to take Chinese ideology to the Marxist left. And I define this in terms of a more complex debate, which really did not reach its maturation until about 5 years into Xi Jinping's rule at the 19th Party Congress in 2017. And if I can step back from it for a minute, it's a bit like these lines. Mao Zedong described the Chinese Communist Party's central challenge, central task, or to use the Chinese phrase, its central contradiction, a Marxist phrase, as class struggle at home and abroad. And if you look at the architecture of Mao's policy and strategy in the period post-49, class struggle at home, combating imperialism abroad, the military engagement in Korea, support for the Vietnamese Revolution. These things actually translated through into the real world as well. Of course, there came a point by the mid-1950s when the party said at the 8th Party Congress in 1956, well, we've been doing this stuff for a while. We've got the Americans under control at 38th parallel. We've collectivized agriculture. We've nationalized industry. We've conducted a serious class struggle and eliminated the landlord class and the capitalist comprador class. Surely it's time now to flip the dial in terms of the party's central ideological challenge towards unleashing the factors of production, not simply being preoccupied with what Marxists call the relations of production, which is a euphemism for class. And sure enough, at the 8th Party Congress in 1956, they resolved that. And Deng Xiaoping, who comes into the scene much later on again, is already by that stage Vice Premier of the State Council in charge of the economy, begins heading in this direction, until such time, of course, as Mao reacts and says, this is going too far. And then you see the anti-rightist movement of 1958. You see the Great Leap Forward and the accelerated collectivization of agricultural and industry in that period, resulting in untold catastrophes for the country at large. And despite the reaction to that at the Lushan plenum in the early 60s, Mao's further counterattack against this attempt to revise the central ideological challenge of the party with the Cultural Revolution and the mass mayhem which it unleashed. In other words, by the time you get to the end of the Mao period, you have had this series, this wave of attacks from, let's call it, the political and ideological left of the party against those seeking to redefine the central challenge of the modern Chinese Communist Party from 1956 onwards as growing the economy, lifting people out of poverty, and therefore raising people's living standards, which he saw as the primary challenge of socialism. Deng Xiaoping, in his second historical resolution of 1981, summarized it in these terms. He said, we still are in what he described as the primitive stage or the primary stage of socialism. And in the primary stage of socialism, we cannot therefore overly accelerate these policy tools of collectivization of agriculture and industry to the point of ultimately extinguishing any form of private incentive and profit motive. And so by this artful ideological device of characterizing where China stood in the post-81 period as still being in the primary stage of socialism, he was able ideologically to justify the introduction of pro-market mechanisms into the economy and incentives for both farmers and then for those engaged in small-scale light industrial enterprises and then those engaged across the totality of the economy. Roll the clock along then to 2017, 35 years later. What does Xi Jinping do in the 19th Party Congress in his report? He formally redefines again for the first time in 35 years the party's central challenge, the central task, again, its central contradiction, the 主要的矛盾. And he says, these 35 years have been pretty interesting, but we've now seen emerge a whole series of imbalances in China's development, becoming code language for corruption in the party, code language for the relegation of the whole quest for equality within the country, as well as the relegation of the party itself. And so Xi Jinping, in the 19th Party Congress report, then comes out and says, therefore we're entering into a new era, the third era in China's revolutionary history, the first being Mao, the second being Deng, the third now being myself, Xi Jinping. And I will use this new era to rectify the imbalances from the past. That becomes code language in turn for a series of political interventions in the real world economy, again in real world politics, but beyond that in terms of China's engagement with the outside world as well. And so the argument that I put in the book is that this evolving ideological narrative from the Mao period through the Deng period into the Xi period. And in this Xi period, you see as a consequence of ideological change and moving to the Marxist left on the economy, a deliberate re-emphasis on the role of state-owned enterprises vis-a-vis the private sector, a reinvestment into the absolute centrality of an empowered industrial policy, reinforced by large-scale industrial funds, which are gargantuan in size, versus the free operation of the market, and a re-emphasis or emphasis for the first time since 1981 of the common prosperity doctrine in terms of wealth redistribution. So my overall thesis is that ideological change, changing the definition of the party's central contradiction, and moving the dial away from untrammeled reform and opening to now activist interventions in the economy, have in fact resulted in a series of concrete economic policy measures which flow from this ideological shift which we saw documented in 2017. So it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the dual circulation economy, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about other elements of formal economic policy exposition under Xi Jinping, the subsequent party central economic work conferences and central financial work conferences take their lead from what happened in 2017, reinforcing my thesis that ideology matters. The change in the terms of the headwaters of the ideological debate then flow through to what we then see in the real world of the economy. So when people say today, I wonder why the economy is not performing well, and why don't they just fix it, people need to reflect on the deep ideological decisions taken in 2017 as to why Xi Jinping saw that there was a better and alternative course of action to preserve the party's power in the economy, to preserve the power of the state in relation to the private sector, and to engineer a more equal set of economic outcomes than were otherwise being prosecuted through a period of untrammeled reform and opening. I'll finish on this. The third element of ideological change, which I map in the book, is somewhat more controversial. I call it Xi Jinping's decision to move China's ideological agenda towards the nationalist right. That is, moving Leninism to the left, moving the economy to the Marxist left, and moving foreign security policy towards the nationalist right. And you see this redolent in his literature again from 2012-13 on, about a decision on his part that, given the fact that China's comprehensive national power had become much greater in the intervening 35 years, that the time had come, therefore, to much more vigorously, actively assert China's interests and values in the region and the world, and in relation to the United States. We saw this, of course, writ large, most spectacularly in the 2014 Central Foreign Affairs Work Conference, which for the first time began speaking of, and I was struck by this at the time, 10 years ago. I remember watching this on television in Beijing late into the evening one night when you're seriously entertainment deprived. You're watching Central Chinese Television 1, then there aren't even any decent ads. And sure enough, there was the rendition of China now being engaged in a struggle for the future of the international system. And this was a phrase which hit me between the eyeballs, because Deng Xiaoping's previous axiom had been, hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead. But underneath it all was a decision which said China, for its reform policy to succeed domestically and unleashing the factors of production and growing the economy and raising people's living standards, was that this would only be turbocharged by a massive drive for Chinese exports into the world, and therefore accepting the broad terms established for the international economic order as led by the United States. That orthodoxy, parallel to Deng's domestic agenda, which I described before, was again in 2014 turned on its head by Xi Jinping in a deliberate and active ideological move. And since that Central Foreign Affairs Work Conference, the first of 3 such conferences in the last 10 years, we see, therefore, a more assertive and vigorous Chinese foreign and security policy in the region and the world. wolf warriors may have come and gone, but the underlying assertion of China's power, influence, position, and determination to secure its territorial interests in disputed territorial questions in East Asia and the West Pacific and on the Sino-Indian border are now much clearer, defined than they've ever been before, together with the active and accelerated expansion of the Chinese military in a new and more assertive form of China's exercising and interdiction of foreign military forces deemed to be in Chinese sovereign territory at any given time. So therefore, these are the three sets of interrelated ideological changes which I seek to map in the book. I've spoken for long enough now, but I'm sure with Jude we can then pursue, as he's indicated to me he would like to pursue. Okay, Kevin, that's terrific. If you think ideology has been a useful, but not exclusive, predictor of where Chinese politics and the economy and foreign security policy have gone in the last 10 years, so therefore, physician, heal thyself and tell us where it will go for the next 10 years. And so with that entree and with some fear and trepidation, I yield myself to cross-examination by Jude Blanchette, Senior Counsel. Thank you very much.
Well, please answer the first question, which you've, first of all, thank you, Ambassador Rugg, for your time, and also a huge note of congratulations for writing this wonderful, stimulating book. Time is short, and I know I want to keep enough time for folks to ask questions here, so just a few from me. And actually, maybe also for the audience, one of the most unique things about the vantage point you bring to this, aside from the formal academic study, is you've been able to see Xi Jinping with a number of different hats that I think, unless there's any other former prime ministers, foreign ministers in here, I think you might be the only one who could both bring an intellectual and scholarly angle, reading the documents, weighing through the text, but also a more tactile understanding of Xi Jinping as leader of a country, grand strategist, also a bureaucrat, and also a politician, someone who needs to keep and hold together coalitions. So I wonder if I could, just as an initial question, ask you to explain your, how do you think about Xi Jinping with those various hats? Let's say national leader, let's say a politician, and let's say grand strategist. What's your estimation of him across those three domains?
I think one of the reasons why I don't entitle this book or describe it as a biography is because I'm very bad at psychology, which is, and having been a political leader myself, the idea of me interpreting why another political leader is doing X because of where he or she grew up, how many times they were bashed up in the playground at school, etc., etc. I'm kind of not into that stuff because I think it's largely unknowable, frankly, unless you're Freud, unless you're Jung, or unless you're Freud or Jung's counselor. So that's not kind of my shtick. So therefore, I put that to one side. Mine is a more limited aspiration here. Mind you, there are good efforts at biographies of Xi Jinping that are out there, including one by Liz Economy. Mine is to intellectual biography overstated, ideological biography is more to the point, which is why have they assembled this body of works, this canon of Xi Jinping's ideological thinking in the way in which the system is done and which he plainly has authorized. And what meaning, what band of meaning is he seeking to project to the 100 million members of the Communist Party in terms of the way forward? That's what interests me. And that, because, as I said before, it becomes a useful predictor of the future. In terms of personal reflections on the guy, I've been in a number of one-on-one meetings with him, and I've been in a number of small group meetings with him. What I've always said about Xi Jinping is that, and contrary to much of the internal criticism of him, is that within China itself, is that I've always seen Xi Jinping as very much wrapped in his own deep understanding of Chinese history and his understanding of international history. He is, I won't say history buff, that's not the right term, but he is immersed in the reading of his own country's history, classical and modern, as well as some reading and translation of world history as well. And so therefore, it's important for us to understand that because he brings to bear an historian's perspective, which is where he thinks and concludes China lies in the current period of time. So I think that is important for us to understand. The second thing I think is important for us to understand is that he sees himself, in my judgment, both from what I read about what he writes, but also in encounters with him over the years, is he sees himself as a man of history, that is, an actor in history, and not just a small actor in history, but a large actor in history. And therefore, it is important for us to understand that as well. The third element I throw into the equation and why I wrote this book was when we talk about being immersed in his own country's history and him seeing himself as an historical actor of significance, is he also sees himself as a Marxist-Leninist, and with a Marxist-Leninist view of history. And if you look at the epistemological tools of Marxism-Leninism, historical materialism, dialectical materialism, it's often tough for American audiences and frankly broader Western audiences to get terribly excited by all this stuff. It just sounds so exotic. But my melancholy duty is to inform you is that if you read this stuff, the entire ideological canon of Xi Jinping is immersed in this stuff. Where China currently sits in the evolution of historical materialism, for example, and why its age is now, as it were, arriving, its time is arriving. And it's his approach to dialectical materialism, which is, of course, about the unity of opposites and how you are dealing with the contradictions or opposing forces mounted against you at home and abroad at a given time. He sees himself as an active period of struggle, as we've all seen in his speech-making over time. So the reason I say these things, it's not just, a classical Chinese view of history in terms of historical cycles, etc. Nor is it simply a person who sees himself as an active figure in history like Qianlong or Kangxi. He is an active ideologue, and therefore this informs his framework about China's moment having arrived, conclusions of historical materialism, and where his principal points of struggle now lie, both at home and abroad. The United States and its allies, and frankly those seeking to oppose the politics of a more Marxist-Leninist state within the country.
One of the things Charlie mentioned in his introductory comments is the importance of reading this book, but thinking about this question for how we understand China's trajectory, including in a period after Xi goes to see Marx. I'm curious how you think about Xi Jinping thought as either the distillation of one singularly powerful leader's view of the world and what China should do. How much of this is the product of a consensus within the senior-most elements of the system that is given the name of Xi Jinping thought, but actually has deeper roots? Or option three is, of course, all of the above. But I'm curious how you think about the interplay between this being a singular contribution of Xi Jinping and there's the chance that these ideas evaporate after his exit, or these have staying power because they speak to something deeper about the system.
Well, as you know, this is the much wider debate in the social sciences between agency and structure, and the agency of Xi Jinping's leadership versus the structure of the Chinese Communist Party and its underlying worldview. What I can map and have sought to map through this book is quite dramatic changes in the ideological frame and worldview of the current Communist Party since 2012. If I look at the way in which he articulates, explains, and then executes his notion of a Leninist party, it is vastly different to what we saw evolve in the post-78 period. Of course, with the big exception of what erupted in Tiananmen in 1989. Similarly, if I look at where he's taken the economy in terms of Marxist orthodoxy, or his definition of Marxist orthodoxy, and our own engagements with Chinese think tankers, we understand that this actually is pulling the system in a direction which is vastly different to where those who have been previous custodians of the orthodoxy on market reform and opening in the Chinese system would have taken it. And they've opposed it and failed. Similarly, in terms of the foreign policy establishment and the national security establishment, there are those who have argued internally that, in fact, Xi Jinping has gone too hard, too early, too definitively in relation to his assertion and confrontation with the United States and allies in Taiwan than was previously the wisdom under hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead. So my argument on the agency versus structure thesis is as follows. These three are dramatic changes. Therefore, I reach a logical conclusion that the party consensus didn't simply sit around in a teepee and work out, having held hands for a while, that in fact the dialectic had truly moved on and that we have reached a new level of collective consciousness. He actually dragged the party into this direction, as Mao had done in previous periods as well. You don't see a whole lot of dissent about Mao's definition of class struggle during the Cultural Revolution. A, because a whole bunch of people had already been purged, and B, those who wanted to survive just kept putting their hand up at the relevant meetings. So my argument would be that the system, with some reluctance, has come with him, that he is the primary mover against the logic that I just ran through.
Final question, and then would like to open up to the audience is, I realize you've already indicated that you don't do pop psychology, but if I can press the issue one more time, is ask you to put yourself in the shoes of one of the tens of millions of cadres in the system who are reading Xi Jinping's most recent speech in Choushir magazine at a party study group.
Party secretary for Shanghai No. 4 glue factory.
and trying to figure out, what do I do with this, right? I had a set of clear incentive structures 20 years ago, right? I was my locality, grow, smother over the side effects so that way they don't affect my promotion. Now I'm in this liminal phase where, yes, the economy still matters, but I'm hearing these creeping discussions of security threats, and now I've got this layer of Xi Jinping thought that is coming at me fast and furious in a number of directions. What do you think this looks like in terms of translating the ideas that you've distilled here across this entire wide sweep of policy domains? Is this going to work? How does the system process this? And what does this mean for sort of policy making and state capacity in China?
I think it's a really good question, Jude, because it asks from the bottom up, from the ground up, how is ideology read? Given that this is the system imposing it from the top down and from the leader down. Number one is, my observation over a long period of time is that what's remarkable about the Chinese system is how the party, 100 million members, are trained in how to read ideological change and shift. As you know, at the party school, there are courses which are conducted in how to read the line in the Remin Rabal, the People's Daily. I should have attended one of those when I first went there as first secretary. It would have saved a lot of time. But the rest of us who are foreign barbarians usually discover through trial and error as to what the paragraph 4 in the beginning of the Ke paragraph means, which is but. So the level of literacy, including the number 2 cadre at the Shanghai No. 4 glue factory, in how to read this stuff is somewhat more sophisticated than we think. That's my first point. Number 2, what would they therefore deduce in terms of changes in the line? And following the luxian, the line, is, as you know, an important consideration for surviving in Chinese Communist Party politics. They would deduce the following. A, that we cannot engage in any activity which could result in us being accused of being corrupt. And part of the reassertion of the virtues and value of the Leninist Party is an anti-corruption campaign, which is now the longest rolling campaign in the party's history, now more than 10 years old. What does that mean in practice? It means that when I engage with the private sector to do X, Y, and Z and A, B, C, all the consumers of my glue at the number 4 Shanghai glue factory, is that I have to be hugely mindful of not engaging in any activity which could result in an anonymous accusation against me. What does that induce? High levels of caution. High levels of caution becoming inertia. High levels of caution becoming inertia, and perhaps even worse. I think the second thing is, related to this, is, and you anticipated this in the question, Jude, which is so much of the reassertion of the role of the state in the economy is not just about delivering more Marxist economic outcomes in terms of equality and a more central role for the party. It's also preparation for the state against future national security crises for the country. If they did end up in a future Taiwan-related security crisis, for example, Xi Jinping's rejuvenation of the entire Maoist concept of zili gengsheng, self-reliance, is now a comprehensive national orthodoxy again, which is how do we therefore produce a China which will be resilient in the face of future national security challenges where our access to global markets is then blocked off. The subtext to all of the above is be suspicious increasingly of foreigners. And therefore, if you are at the party secretary at the number 4 glue factory in Shanghai, and you would normally welcome co-investors in what you were doing from the International Society of Glue Manufacturers, headquartered in Milwaukee, you will now be very mindful of the dangers being posed to yourself by being too close to foreign partners and foreign business operatives. Those are 2 examples. That is caution, bordering on inertia in terms of being accused of corrupt activity with your own domestic client base or provider base. And secondly, caution in terms of dealing with foreigners, certainly as co-investors and collaborators in a particular industry sector. I think that there are 2 ways in which it would be read, and if there's one further one, it is just that when in doubt, when the Chinese system is in doubt, lie flat, not in the classical Tang Ping sort of sense of be out there and don't go to work, but keep your head down. And that is not a recipe for winning an economic contest now, which is all about technological innovation, enterprise, and being at the sharpest edge. Those would be my answers to your question.
Let's open it up to 2 house rules. The first is 1 question, not 2, 3, 4, 5. And the other one, this might be somewhat controversial, is they must actually be questions and not statements of opinion, although I deeply care what all of you think personally about all these issues. Just for time reasons, a brief question would be helpful. So right here, please. Microphone will come around.
Hi, Ambassador Rudd. I'm Lisa Hannett from Busan, Hamilton. I would like to ask if Xi Jinping's ideology has an endgame, and is that endgame to make the world safe for Marxist-Leninist systems, or to be the most important voice in international policy? And if so, is it derived from something like historical materialism or something else? Thanks.
I think it's a really important question that you raise, because it is a totalizing system of thought. It's the secular equivalent of Roman Catholicism. I mean, I grew up as a Roman Catholic. Think about the Catholic Church, it's got an answer for everything, okay? You mightn't agree with all those answers, but it's got an answer for everything. A bit like the Chinese Communist Party, it's got an answer for everything. And so it's totalizing. It's totalizing in terms of its epistemology. It's totalizing in terms of its millenarian concept of the end state, which is the evolution from slave society through feudal society, through capitalist society, through socialist society. The end state, of course, being communism. If you read Xi Jinping's speech on the 200th anniversary of Marx's birth, in 2018, it is really eye-opening in terms of where he sees the long-term ideological destination of the country as lying. So that is his desired end state, and still with the Leninist Party in place to guide the Chinese nation to that end state, post-socialism and into communism. Internationally, what I find fascinating is the following. There's a whole new debate emerging, which I cover in the very last chapters of the book, because it's quite recent, about Xi's notion of so-called second integration. What is the second integration? Sorry if this sounds all too nerdy, but he is saying, here is communism, and here is effectively, and they do tacitly acknowledge this, a foreign ideology. Marx and Lenin did not grow up in Shanghai, okay? They didn't even grow up in Hunan, okay? Lenin was a Russian and Marx was a German. And so here we have a German ideology translated through a Bolshevik revolution and the Comintern into the Chinese system through the events of the 20s and the 30s. And so what's the Chinese system said in its own historiography is that we have sinified communism through Mao Zedong, and we've done so in particular ways. In particular, and the one example that is always pointed to is Mao Zedong's conclusion, contrary to Marxist-Leninist doctrine and dogma, that the revolution could begin and be concluded successfully in the countryside and not in the cities. This is the first integration of sinifying Marxism-Leninism. The second integration is happening now, according to the Xi Jinping literature and Xi Jinping thought literature. And that is taking where socialism with Chinese characteristics is reached in this decade and beginning to incorporate into it, wait for it, classical concepts, ideas and language from the Chinese classical tradition into, let's call it conventional Chinese Marxism-Leninism, in order to broaden its appeal within the country at large. That I find interesting, because it's saying we will further sinify Chinese Marxism-Leninism, but take this message to the broader masses beyond the party in a manner which is acceptable and digestible and believable. Then, this is my term I use in the book, because they haven't used this term yet. There is the very beginnings of the ideas of the third integration. They don't use that term. But the third integration content would be using certain acceptable concepts in world culture and incorporating those into this evolving canon of socialism with Chinese characteristics to make it a much more appealing and acceptable ideology for the world at large. And that is just now being talked about within the party's ideological circles. It's a separate question, of course, whether any of this stuff actually will work or not. But if you look seriously at how China, for example, in its new pitch to the Global South, right across from the Belt and Road Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative, Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, is seeking to, frankly, broaden the ideological appeal of a new form of Marxism-Leninism, dressed in much more comfortable clothes, then this, I think, provides a pointer in that direction.
Questions we're going to take. Why don't I take three just for in the interest of time? We're right there, and then gentleman in the middle, and then right here in the front.
My name is Artem Gergun. I'm from Kennan Institute at Wilson Center. I'd like to ask a question about Russia. What is the view of modern Russia, which once back in 1980s already proclaimed reaching the advanced stage of socialism? And
what is the view of Putin's Russia in?
Russia already, as a Soviet Union, they already have proclaimed reaching the advanced stage of socialism back in the 80s, if I'm not mistaken. And what is the Xi Jinping's view of modern Russian elite? Because from that socialist point of view, they look like traitors who betrayed the original idea of the Leninist project. So what would be your comments on this topic? Thank you.
My name is Anupam Khanna. I used to be at the World Bank and lived in China at the same time in the first tour. We opened the office there. My question goes back to this agency structure issue. I've been talking to people here and in India, China friends. Some view is that the first 5 years up to this 2017, there was a general consensus. In fact, Xi Jinping was mandated, and his selection was to move in this direction. And the question is whether the elders and even the party elites underestimated his ability and his mastery of the politics. They never thought he would be able to do it as effectively. And what have been the implications of that? Related to that is that's for the first two, Leninist Marxist shift, ideological change.
I've got to get a couple more questions,
Sure,
and that's a great question.
But what the role of the military has been on the third one, that is a view that obviously concerns people in India and I think Philippines, for example.
And then right here in the front, the conspicuous copy of Ambassador Rudd's book.
Thank you. Hi, Ambassador Rudd. I'm Blaise. I'm a Ramsay Scholar at Georgetown studying Master of Foreign Service.
Are you Australian?
I am, yes.
Okay.
From Melbourne.
I've got a dulcet Australian accent.
Thank you.
It's pure Shakespearean English, in case you understand.
My question is, as you know, I'm studying Mearsheimer, Kissinger, Kevin Rudd. What are the students in China studying to understand great power politics?
So Xi's view of modern Russian elite, was Xi underestimated? And then you heard the last one.
The complex debate between Soviet communism and Chinese communism, I think from your question you're familiar with. Let's never forget that the Chinese system, really after the Sino-Soviet split in the late 50s, routinely referred to the Soviet Union as not just revisionist, but as representing the forces of Soviet social imperialism. This also became an ideological device used by Deng Xiaoping, even when Mao was still alive. Remember his address to the United Nations in 1974, where Deng Xiaoping, having to explain what had just happened with Nixon going to China, was forced to basically say the principal contradiction lies with these bloody Soviet revisionists who are out there doing terrible things in the world and to us. And the secondary contradiction are the capitalist imperialists in the United States. So how does the Chinese system view post-Soviet Russia from an ideological lens? I think their view is twofold, if I look carefully at Xi Jinping's language. One of this great sense of ideological remorse about the failure of the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 to continue. Secondly, remember his phrase, the world is now witnessing developments and changes not seen in 100 years. It was first articulated in 2017, making clear that in his view, China now had become the torchbearer for the new wave of changes which the Bolshevik Revolution had unleashed first off back in 1917. But I think his real world view of where post-Soviet Russia now stands, within his overall view of, let's call it comprehensive national power, the correlation of forces, and the overall trends of history, is that this alignment between Putin's Russia and Xi Jinping's China is advantageous against now the inversion of where the principal contradictions lie. The principal contradiction now lies with the United States and its allies in the world. And whatever historical contradictions exist with the Russians on the border no longer exist. That would have been my best attempt at answering your question. In terms of did they underestimate Xi, I think two answers to that. One is, on the economy, and I noticed your World Bank background, sir, I'm not sure from reading the documentary record that Xi Jinping had in fact a Marxist blueprint for the economy in his mind in 2012. He had a Leninist imprint in his mind about what to do with the party. And of course that ultimately intersects therefore with the economy as well. I also have a view that if you look at the intensification And also we saw the 2013 so-called decision document of the third plenum of the 18th Central Committee, which was to take reform even further. And remember, its seminal conclusion a decade or so ago was that the market would play then the central organising role in the allocation of resources in the Chinese economy. So we might say to ourselves, what happened? I have a theory about that. I cannot prove it, and it's called the China's domestic financial crisis of 2015. And the Chinese domestic financial crisis of 2015, which many of us have forgotten about, was massive. And there was a grave concern then about implosion of the Chinese financial system. My conclusion from that is that Xi Jinping turned to his market economists and said, do you guys really know what you're doing? Do you really have the levers of control in hand? Or do we need to double down in a much more statist, partyist direction in terms of central economic management? That then dovetailed with his pro-party view and his Leninist view, and what then was consummated in 2017 in the party's final resolution that its overall approach to economic strategy then had to change. I think there was this seminal event which caused him to conclude that the party's credibility could be at risk for its failure and inability to prevent and then effectively manage that financial crisis. The third question was?
What are students in China reading? If we're reading Mearsheimer, I'll question that, but we're reading Rudd, certainly. What are they reading?
I think in terms of their understanding of the Western intellectual debate, they're reading three sets of authors at the moment. One is Mearsheimer, as Mearsheimer constantly says, and I radically disagree with John on practically everything, and I've debated him publicly twice, once in Australia, the other time in New York, and it's been full on, full frontal, and without bodily armour protection. Because ultimately Mearsheimer dismisses agency, that is the ability of any political leader to bring about change. And frankly, as a previous political practitioner, that's just so much bullshit. Before you indulge in the deep academic literature on agency. Secondly, they read Allison from Harvard on Thucydides' Trap, and this has a huge readership within China and in translation. The third, I think they read largely for intellectual comfort purposes, is Kishore Mahbubani on the, shall I say, the inevitability of the historical decline of the West and the inevitability of the rise of the East. And again, I disagree with Kishore's thesis as well. The worrying thing about the academy in China these days is the fact that there are limits now, even at China's most elite universities, and what it is permissible to read. And that is, I think, a problem for the future. I doubt this will be on the reading list somehow.
Well, we're at time, and I want to give time for Ambassador Rudd to sit out and sign some books. So if you would please join me in thanking him for his excellent comments today. That concludes this part. If I could ask, instead of folks coming up here to talk to him, we'll just usher him out to the table, and I'm sure he'd be happy to chat and sign books. Thank you.